As Dr. James Gutowski once said, war speeds all development. World War II embodied this quote as we look at inventions that are still being used and improved on today, such as nuclear energy, the nuclear bomb, jet engines, superglue, and even ballpoint pens. As well as development, the war increased productivity, especially in the automotive industry. While young men enlisted or were drafted into the armed forces, many other citizens found ways to do their part for the war effort, such as conserving any resources that could be of use and working extra shifts in factories to make supplies for the soldiers. In 1939, the U.S. military was laughable, but Roosevelt was about to change that, and America, forever. "We must all be the great arsenal of democracy," Roosevelt said during his December 29, 1940 fireside chat. "For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same sense of urgency, the same spirit of patriotism, and sacrifice as we would show were we at war." The Axis powers laughed at the speech and scoffed at the subsequent production goals. In 1942, a month after the attack on Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt said America would build 60,000 planes for the next year, and the next year after, it would be more than double that number.
After the December 7, 1941 Japanese attack on the American naval fleet at Pearl Harbor, the U.S. was thrust into World War II, and everyday life across the country was dramatically altered. Food, gas, and clothing were rationed. Communities conducted scrap metal drives. From the outset of the war, it was clear that enormous quantities of airplanes, tanks, warships, rifles, and other weapons would be essential to beating America's aggressors. U.S. workers played a vital role in the production of such war-related materials. Many of these workers were women. Indeed, with tens of thousands of American men joining the armed forces and heading into training and into battle, women began securing jobs as welders, electricians, and riveters in defense plants. Until that time, such positions had been strictly for men only. At the beginning of World War II, there were 12 automakers left in the United States, boiling down from the hundreds that had been producing auto early in the 20th century. Indeed, many projects began before the war started. However, within 3 months after December 7, 1941, all private automotive production stopped. U.S. manufacture of automobiles halted completely. No cars, commercial trucks, or auto parts were made from February 1942 to October 1945.
Car makers shifted production to war materials. The auto industry retooled to manufacture tanks, trucks, jeeps, airplanes, bombs, torpedoes, steel helmets, and ammunition under massive contracts issued by the government. Beginning immediately after the production of automobiles ceased, entire factories were upended almost overnight. Car tools were pushed to the side and covered with tarps as tool and die men created the implements of war. Assembly lines were reconfigured, half-finished parts were sent to steel mills to be remelted, tens of thousands of people were hired and trained. Logistics of unimaginable proportions were penned to get Spitfire engines to England, tanks to Russia, and guns to China, all the while building up America's very real military arsenal. Blueprints were studied, shared, and often improved. Meanwhile, individuals and communities conducted drives for the collection of scrap metal, aluminum cans, and rubber, all of which were recycled and used to produce armaments. Individuals purchased U.S. war bonds to help pay for the high cost of armed conflict.
On January 1st, 1942, all sales of cars, as well as the delivery of cars to customers who had previously contracted for them, were frozen by the government's Office of Production Management. As a temporary measure, local rationing boards could issue permits allowing people who had contracted for cars before January 1st to secure delivery. By February of 1942, all of the major automobile makers had their production lines shut down as a result of a production freeze on their 1940s automobiles. All existing stock of unsold cars were managed by our government for the war effort. These cars were the leftover 1941 and 1942 models and were rationed out on a as-needed basis for civilian and military use. During the production freeze, automakers became around-the-clock defense contractors. In general terms, no 1940s automobiles were produced in 1943 or 44. With that said, the auto industry claims that there were 139 cars built in 1943 and 610 built in 1944. The government's Office of Price Administration imposed rationing of gasoline and tires and set a national speed limit of 35 miles per hour. The U.S. auto industry produced 20% of the total U.S. output of the material manufactured to fight World War II, with the total value of goods produced by the U.S. automobile industry in the war effort surpassed $29 billion. While the auto companies were the logical manufacturers of trucks, armored cars, jeeps, and tanks, the production line was extensive and many of the items built were new to the industry. Both Ford and General Motors both built entire warplanes for the conflict, and many aircraft components were produced by the industry.
Ford built airplane engines for the British government, B-24 Liberator and glider bombers for the U.S. military. Ford also turned out tanks, armored cars, jeeps, and engines for robot bombs. Ford's plants in Great Britain and Canada had joined the production efforts of the United States and produced everything from mobile canteens to four-wheel drive trucks and autos, grenades, bombs, and engine-powered landing crafts. General Motors converted all of its production to the war effort and delivered more than $12 billion worth of goods, ranging from airplanes to tanks, marine diesel engines, trucks, machine guns, and shells. No other manufacturer delivered as much material to the Allied forces. Chrysler made everything from fuse bomb noses, forging and machining shells, cartridge cases, tanks, anti-aircraft guns, aircraft engines, and they played a major role in the B-24 bomber. They also made assorted military vehicles such as command cars, ambulances, trucks, and weapon carriers.
On the left is a Fisher body Grand Blanc Michigan-produced M10 Wolverine. In the center is an M18 Hellcat built in Flint, Michigan by the Buick Motor Car Division of GM. On the end is an M36 also built in Flint, Michigan. There is no greater testament to the U.S. automobile industry's contribution to help win World War II than this M4A3 Sherman tank combat veteran, on display in downtown Bastogne, Belgium. The nose section of the B-29 Enola Gay. This is one of the most infamous aircraft of all time, being the first bomber to drop a nuclear weapon. The B-29 was built by Chrysler DeSoto Division in Detroit, Michigan.
Over the course of the war, the government estimated that about 1 million cars had been taken off the road by their owners to reserve for their own use after the war. In the autumn of 1944, looking then toward the end of the war, Ford, Chrysler, Nash, and Fisher Body of General Motors received authorization from the War Production Board to do preliminary work on experimental models of civilian passenger cars, on condition that it would not interfere with war work and that employees so used to be limited to planning engineers and technicians. Limits were also set on the amount of labor and materials the companies could divert to this. As Ford's corporate historian Bob Kripke once said, perhaps the most amazing thing was the speed in which they changed over from cars to war machines.